Hey team, before we dive into today's episode, I've got a quick favour to ask. The Women's Football Hub merch store is now live, and every purchase helps support our work as a non-profit championing women and girls football from the ground up. There's something for everybody, adults and kids. There's loads of colours and sizes, and your support helps us grow the game one piece of apparel at a time. Just head over to www.womensfootballhub.com to check it out. Thanks for backing the hub, and now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to Women's Football Hub. I am your host for this episode. I am Carolyn Kent, and today we are talking about sports nutrition and football. And I have brought back my friend from Buckinghamshire New University. Welcome back to Women's Football Hub, Phil Woodbridge.
Thanks, Carolyn. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you back, actually, because I know you've been working pretty hard on your PhD, right?
Yeah, getting towards the end, so it's full on at the moment.
Now, it is, because obviously I think it's next year that you should have everything submitted by. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's looking to Easter time next year. So I'm in the sort of writing up phase of it. So all the data work's done. It's just now putting it to paper.
Now, obviously, for anybody who's interested in your PhD, because you are actually studying amateur footballers, and that's what we want to speak about today with nutrition, those that don't tend to get performance and sports nutrition input. So we're going to chat about that today. If you're interested in Phil's PhD, we have an earlier podcast where we take a really deep dive into what it is that he's doing. But the first thing I want to go over with you, Phil, is your role at Buckinghamshire New University. What is that like?
It's a mixture. I'm a sports nutritionist, so I'm an SENR qualified sports nutritionist. So I act as the university's nutritionist. So we support a number of athletes through the task scheme, the talented athlete pathway. So we support them, and then I do a bit of teaching on sports nutrition on various programs that we run, but I also run the lab. So I'm the technician as well. So I've got a number of roles, and then also I'm studying for a PhD in sports nutrition. So yeah, lots of plates to spin.
Are you like me? You read things, and honestly, the more I read, the less I know. That's how I feel. People say to me, you should be specialist in this women's football. And I'm like, the more I read, honestly, the more I realise I've got giant gaps.
Yeah. I think the thing is, particularly with sports nutrition, it's relatively young sports science. So there's so much material coming out all the time. It is a job keeping up with all the latest research and all the latest papers. And yeah, it's a constant process. Yeah.
It's hard, and then you find papers that completely contradict everything you've ever known, and then you start to shake your own foundations. It's very strange. And then I often obviously look at some papers and go, yes, that ticks my bias, so obviously that's true. So I get to a point where I'm like, do I actually know anything about this topic? But anyway, one of the things that kind of linked you and I, you were looking at nutrition and its impact on injury and recovery, weren't you? So that's why, from a physiotherapy perspective, I was very interested in that. So let's just have a very brief and quick overview about your PhD and what it is that you've been doing. And anyone that's interested in a deep dive, they can look at the previous podcast that we did last year.
That's right. So I'm on to the third study. So I've completed 3 studies as part of the PhD. So study 1 was looking at recreational players and what they ate, where they were eating, what they should eat. Study 2, I then did an intervention using a behaviour change methodology to see if we could improve their diets and whether improving various elements of knowledge and motivation and stuff like that, it improved their intakes, and it did to a certain extent. And then the third study, which is one we're going to talk to you about today, was the whole of my study was looking at nutrition and injury. And then really, because you're waiting for players to be injured, one of the main sort of methodologies for studying players is case studies, because you can take a player and you can do what the science suggests while they're recovering from injury. So that's what I did with 3 cases, all in recreational female players, one that had been part of the previous program. So her nutrition knowledge had improved quite a lot when she got injured. The other 2 were new players that hadn't been part of the other studies. So it was 3 different scenarios looking at taking the nutritional science, what we know or what we think we know would help while you're recovering from injury, and putting that into practice.
It's interesting, isn't it? I don't expect you to know the answer to this, because this is actually probably a PhD in itself. There's a lot of chat going on around about low energy availability, and we know that disordered eating from the FeedPro study, roughly about 1 in 5 professional footballers can have elements of disordered eating, right? So I suppose my question is, how important is the role of nutrition, low energy availability, and is there a link to injury? I think the hypothesis is certainly there. I'm not sure if we've got the data to prove that. We obviously have some data with regards to low energy availability, and then of course REDS, which again, that's another thing that people have
Yeah.
questioned recently as well, isn't it? So do you think that nutrition has a massive role to play with regards to injury?
I think it has a role, whether it's massive or not. And like you say, I don't think we've got the science that proves that one way or the other. But I think my study, so I looked at season 1, improved their nutrition over season 2, and then I looked at them again a season later. So I had various questionnaires that looked at injury rates, self-reported. So it was a questionnaire that had that as part of the questionnaire. And it didn't really show that the players that were eating better had less injuries. What was interesting, though, was that I use this questionnaire called the Leaf Q questionnaire. So it looks at low energy availability, but it doesn't just look at injury. It looks at symptoms like loss of menstrual cycle. It looks at symptoms related to GI problems. And they seem to be the things that the players that ate better had lower instances of GI and menstrual, which would suggest it's going to have an impact on injury, but I didn't actually see that, whether it was too soon. The other thing in football, a lot of the injuries are related to contact type injuries. So the nutrition doesn't really, you might be a bit stronger, but generally it's not the same as an endurance athlete that's running, not got enough energy and ends up with shin splints. They don't tend to be those type of injuries. Less, but I think it's in there in the mix, but we've still got a sort of unproven how big an impact that can have.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've worked with endurance athletes throughout my career, and some of the things one of the ones I was always petrified to miss was a stress fracture of the hip, because of course then you can end up with avascular necrosis, and basically that patient is heading for potentially some sort of hip replacement. So there's elements of knowing your population. I know that there is some evidence in rowing with regards to them looking at low energy availability. Again, massive caloric needs in that type of sport. I think certainly with women's football, there's that spotlight and them being in that sort of media spotlight. And of course, how do they look? A lot of their extra income might come from media commitments. And then of course, the thing that interests me the most is actually when they get injured, and this is something I've seen when I've been working with players, they cut their calories. I'm not being as active, therefore I need to cut the calories. And that's what I want to look at in some sort of depth today, because obviously from a nutrient perspective, there are certain nutrients that are needed for tissue repair and healing, right? So from a nutritional standpoint, what nutrients play the biggest role in tissue repair and healing?
So the classic example is protein. So when you look at the literature, and the energy thing is important. So what you're saying is right, is that players will cut energy because I think they're doing less exercise, but there is an energy cost to the healing process and the recovery process. So you might not be needed to cut energy quite as much as you perhaps initially think, because you're not training and playing football, but your body is healing. And so therefore your energy needs might be slightly less, but not to the extent that possibly the lack of exercise makes you think. And the other one is protein. Protein, because we've got this process of muscle protein breakdown, muscle protein synthesis. That's happening all the time. But when muscle protein breakdown is higher than muscle protein synthesis, we will start to lose muscle mass. And that's obviously something that you want to mitigate while you're recovering from injury. You don't want to cut the calories so much that your body is in effect in a protein deficit. Therefore, you get this muscle atrophy or the breakdown of muscle that generally will occur during injury. The other thing is if you've got your leg, say, in a cast and you're on crutches, there's an energy cost to that. You're getting yourself about, you actually are going to be using a reasonable amount of energy doing that. So cutting energy because you think, I'm not playing football, but there's a lot of other sort of factors in there that you need to be thinking about.
Honestly, you just taking me back to when I had my ACL reconstructed back in May. My arms were aching, like just trying to walk around the house. Like it was incredible. And And I certainly didn't stop getting hungry, I'll tell you that. And even although I've never really had a lot of issues with regards to kind of weight and food and control issues and all those sorts of things, even I was like, do I maybe need to eat a little bit less? Those thoughts definitely did cross my mind. So I suppose my next question then comes is there's been a large push to try and get more carbohydrates into females because we probably don't eat enough carbohydrates for the energy that, or to get the energy that we want to then utilize within football. Do carbohydrates still really matter at times of injury?
I think they still matter because the balance of the diet matters. The balance of the diet shifts. Because you're not playing football, then carbohydrate we use at higher energy intensities. So that's why it's so important when you're playing football at high intensity, you need a big proportion of your diet to be carbohydrate. Whereas when you're injured, yes, you still need carbohydrate. That's part of the sort of balance of the diet that's healthy and going to help with the healing process. But in terms of your total energy, you think we want to increase the protein intake. So if you slightly reduce the energy and you increase the protein to help with that muscle protein synthesis I spoke about, then something's got to give. And it would tend to be the carbohydrate because the total picture is more protein, slightly less calories. So the less calories is going to come from carbohydrate and fat. So it was quite interesting with the 3 players I worked with. That is exactly what I was trying to do. So it was saying, what do we need to achieve from an energy intake to keep you in energy balance? That's most of the literature says one of the important things when you're injured is to stay in energy balance. So not have too much energy so you are putting on body fat, body mass while you're injured, but not having too little energy so you start to lose body mass and that will predominantly be lost in muscle because you're not exercising. So energy balance is crucial. So what I tended to do with the players I was working with was we did weigh them. They came to see me once a month and we did a weight and body comp assessment here, but they also measured themselves at home weekly. So we were just keeping a check on it. We were saying, okay, we don't want you to put too much weight on. We don't want you to lose too much weight. And we were adjusting the energy intake to try and maintain that energy balance and keep their weight stable. So I think that's one sort of quick way. I know it can be a little bit sensitive with players about weighing and doing body comp analysis, but I think when you're injured, if you do check your body weight on the same scales at the same time of day, maybe not on a daily basis, but maybe on a weekly basis, you can just keep a check on it to say, am I staying roughly where I want to be, or is it moving in the wrong direction one way or the other?
Do you know what? It's such a complex topic that, isn't it? Because there are some athletes you'll do that with and they'll be like, yeah, no bother. And there are other athletes that you'll kick off a whole control and oh my God, I've put on extra. And you got to remember that weight will fluctuate during your monthly cycle. And there are are you hydrated? Are you not hydrated? And yeah, it's having those conversations. And I always, when I'm dealing with an athlete, I'm very careful with regards to, look, how's your mental health? How are you feeling?
Yeah.
And just looking after them as a person and
That's
being
right.
careful.
That's one of the big things. I think one of your questions when you sent it through to me was relating to what surprised me about the study. I had 3 players and they were all completely different in their attitude to food, completely different in their relationship to food. And so the way I had to work with them and using the COM-B, this behavior change that I used, it was subtly different between each players because of that. And one thing I would say is, and I know it's not always accessible to players, but working with a nutritionist when you're injured can be one. Obviously, we've got some knowledge, we've got some expertise to deliver, but also developing a relationship with somebody that can understand and can be working with you can hopefully get you through the process with some accountability. I think that's what 2 or 3 of the players said. It made me accountable. Phil was saying to me, "Oh, eat this amount of protein," but I knew I was seeing him next month. Therefore, it kept me accountable, kept me on track.
Yeah, I think all of that, you're essentially bringing up the individual nature of the players that we deal with. And it's picking the right treatment for the right player and also understanding that not every player is a set of tick boxes and choices. And
Yeah,
it's about
exactly.
you being able to mold your treatment and just mold that experience of injury, because it's harder for some players than it is for others. And again, that can bring in lots of things like what is their identity and what's their balance like with regards to their work if they're professional, and then their home life. So there's all of those things that go on. Now, I want to move on slightly. If we look historically at nutrition, fat's bad, right? And we've moved on and gone carbs bad when it comes to women,
Mm.
right? So there's some definite myth busting to be done here. So fats sometimes often get overlooked. Are the specific fats, for example, omega-3s, etc., that help with things like inflammation and recovery?
Yeah, so again, it is a complex area because you get these different phases of injury. So in that very first phase, the sort of in the that inflammation period, when you first get injured, your body is reacting to that injury, whether it's a wound or a muscle pull or whatever, and that instigates an inflammatory response. But that's your body doing its job. So you don't really want to be countering that inflammation by the food you eat. So by taking foods that are anti-inflammatory, like omega-3s, like certain vitamins, A, C, and E, that initially you've got to be quite careful, quite cautious with it. So I would say we wouldn't be supplementing early on in an injury. We wouldn't be looking to take extra omega-3 supplements or anti-inflammatory supplements, because you've got to let the body do its job. But when you come out the other side and you're doing the recovery and rehabilitation, there's Graham Close, who's a big sports nutritionist in this area, who's worked with a lot of national teams, British Lions, etc. He had a paper which was entitled Food First, but Not Only Food. So
Mhm.
that's the way a good nutritionist, most of us within DSNR would work that way. So look at the diet, look at what the player's eating, look at the food, try and get the food right. Now, if there is then some gaps, say if you do, one of my players had stress fractures in her back.
Mm.
And as she was coming out, I was looking at her diet, and we did look at where she was getting her omega-3 fats from, because they were important in that anti-inflammatory period after the initial inflammation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so we were saying maybe we could look to supplement, or maybe we could look to having more fish in the diet, or looking at food first, but then saying, okay, because the other thing that the literature suggests is that when you're working with players, with individuals, when they're recovering, you can't fight on too many fronts. You can't focus on too many things. If I'm saying you need to balance your energy, you need to increase your protein, you need to increase your vitamin D, your vitamin C, it's too much. So
Mm.
if you can focus on two core things, what I quite often would do is then say, let's have a look at the gaps, and then say, okay, maybe we can look at a multivitamin. That ticks that box. We don't have to worry about it. You take a multivitamin or take an omega-3, and it just ticks that box without having to focus too much on it.
Yeah, and it's again, you're bringing back that individual nature, because
Mm.
it's the same when you're prescribing exercise. I can write the best evidence-based program that I've ever done, but if somebody does not want to go to the gym, or does not have the opportunity to go to the gym, or isn't capable of going, it ain't happening. And
Mm.
it's about what can you fit in with regards to nutrition. So let's start to break this down at some practical guidance. What would a day on a plate look like for an injured footballer?
Well, I think
We're
if we go
talking
back, yeah,
amateur
if we
footballer.
go back to that, so I would quite often start with the eat guide, the plate, the eat
Yeah.
plate. So it was roughly sort of 2/3 of the food would be from carbohydrates, whether it's fruit and veg or grains and pasta and stuff like that. So 2/3 of the plate. But if you're injured, like I say, your energy level might come down a little bit and the protein go up. So the proportion of protein will be higher. So if you're saying, oh, you need to have, we're quite often talking grams per kilogram,
Mm.
which I know people might start glazing over. But basically it's saying, okay, we're going to increase that to optimal. So for a 60 kilo player, you might be saying 120 grams of protein a day. Firstly, it depends what that player eats in the first place. If they're a big meat eater and eat lots of fish and meat and have a big proportion of their plate is meat, they might be eating that amount anyway. If they're vegetarian, they're probably not eating that amount. So, horses for courses again. But in broad terms, when I've worked it out, and all my players were about the same, through the case studies, we were looking at shifting from 50 to 60% carbs and 15% protein to about a third. So it's a third carbs, a third protein, a third fat. So you think about shifting your plate, you're almost doubling the amount of protein and then reducing the carbohydrate down proportionately. The thing you've got to remember there is that fat has twice the amount of calories per gram carbohydrates and protein. So the fat, as in the amount of food rather than calories, you're probably talking 40, 40, 20, 40% carbohydrate, 40% protein. So the same amount of carbs to protein, whereas normally it would be double carbohydrate to protein, and then the rest as fat. So hopefully that makes it a little bit simpler in that if you're looking at your plate, you're thinking, saying, I've roughly got to double the amount of protein.
When you're injured, increase the amount of protein. That's really important. Now, I would also say from a recovery perspective, if you're the day after a game, you probably also need to start increasing the protein, because again, that's a big part of recovery. I want to be very clear, I am not a performance nutritionist, but that's certainly some mechanisms that I've seen players do. Now, this is always an interesting one, because when I ask younger girls especially, what is protein? And now I've got a lot of young girls at the moment who are vegetarian and vegan. And I think there's been a couple of things that I've noted here, because I've seen some stress fractures in these populations. And when we go and look at their energy, I was shocked actually that some calories that you would think they were taking in a lot of calories because they're eating quite a bit, but actually because of some of the foods that they're eating, they're actually quite low in calories. Is that your experience with the kind of vegan and vegetarian ethics?
Exactly. It's quite interesting. When I did my master's degree, I did a study on vegan runners, vegetarian, vegan. So I've done quite a lot of work in that area. And you're right, it's the calorie density. You get more food for your calories. When I was working with vegan runners, they would say, Phil, how can I get 2,500 calories? It's so much food.
Yeah.
For a female runner, so much food. So yeah, there's different challenges. What I would say then is you're then talking about looking at foods with higher calorie density to try and get the calories in, but also when we talk about injury, get the protein in. So one of my players she was what they call now flexitarian. So she had certain days where she was vegetarian and certain days where she wasn't. But it meant that what we did was we did look at protein supplements and protein isolates. Stickled you.
Yeah, that's tickled me, because that's how I am at the gym. I'm a flexi-gymitarian. Like, some days I go, some days I don't. Like, but yeah, no, that is interesting. And again, it comes down to, well, what do you feel like eating? What do you not feel like eating? But that I was shocked about the size of the plates that these, people who were vegetarian and vegan were eating. And actually, when you looked at the calorie density, they didn't have a lot of calories on their plate. And then, of course, they were coming in and stress fracture. And it was literally, and I could recognize straight away that yes, physiotherapy needs to be involved with regards to the rehabilitation process, of course, but you don't fix that low energy availability and you don't fix that nutritional element, it's going to just be a recurring problem.
Yeah.
So it brought in really home for me the multidisciplinary team. And then, of course, there are some households where the parents go vegan and vegetarian, the kids then go vegan and vegetarian, and they're doing a lot of sports. So there's all of these sorts of things to think about. Now, a couple of things that I want to just kind of look at, right? When we talk about good proteins, meat eaters versus vegetarians and vegans, what sort of options? If somebody's going to one of the big supermarkets tonight, what sort of options can they think about with regards to proteins?
What, as a meat eater or as a vegetarian?
Let's do meat eater first, and then we'll come on to vegetarian/vegan.
Yeah, chicken, fish, beef, mince, all those classic meat products will be much higher in protein. Obviously, you want to go potentially for the less fatty sources. So lean chicken, lean cuts of meat are important. But then you don't forget about dairy. I think, a lot of nutritionists, we use dairy a lot because whey is a particularly good source of protein. So like you say, when you've got problems with appetite, when you don't feel like eating, they are good sources. Milk, eggs, cheese, milky drinks are a good source. And I quite often suggest those late at night because there is a certain amount of science that suggests you can have a bigger dose of protein at night because your body then will use that throughout the night. And Casein is a different type of protein, but it's slower release. But then you can use that, your body can use that more overnight. So late night milky drink, one, to increase the amount of protein, and then enable your body to then use that protein to help with that rehab process. When we move on to vegetarian and vegan sources, there was obviously there's a lot more availability now than, for instance, when I first went vegetarian.
Yeah.
There weren't the options. So there are a lot of these soya-based proteins. Soya is one where we talked about amino acids. So meat has got all the amino acids that you need for muscle protein synthesis. Some vegetable sources don't. Beans, for instance, won't have all the amino acids. So you have to eat 2 different foods to get all of them. Soya is one of the vegetarian ones that does give you all the amino acids. So soya milk, because the other advantage of soya milk is they're quite often fortified. So you'll get the soya milk, and so you're getting a decent quality protein. It's not quite as high as dairy milk, but it's still reasonably high. So it's one of the better vegetarian ones, but it's quite often got vitamin D, calcium. It's got other things fortified in it. So you're almost getting a bit of a multivitamin as well as with the milk. So I would say for vegetarian vegan sources, look at the beans, pulses, those sort of things as a protein source, but also you can complement that with some of the sort of meat, plant-based alternatives to meat.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you bring that in, because I actually experimented with going vegetarian just earlier this year, and I struggled because I'm looking at with regards to complete proteins versus incomplete proteins and having to combine proteins in order to get them out. And I was just lost by the end of it. And I'll be honest, I definitely made some mistakes with my nutrition at that point. So I think if you are listening and you're thinking, you know what, I'd like to go maybe vegetarian and maybe would like to go vegan, please do have a think about getting some nutritional support at that point, because especially if you are playing sport.
It is harder to get those high, if we're talking about increasing the amount of protein when you're injured, it is harder to get the high levels of protein when you're not eating meat, dairy, and eggs as well. Then yeah, it is harder. So then the supplements, I think, are pretty important in those scenarios.
That's it. And then, of course, you can also bring in the fact that changes of diet can also bring in changes with gut. That can cause problems for players. Whey protein, I've seen a lot of players have gastrointestinal issues with regards to whey protein. Obviously, there are some players who are lactose intolerant. So
Yes,
any change that you make to your diet may have implications on other systems. And I think that's where I've always said this: performance nutritional support for younger athletes, and obviously professional athletes, we're needing to get a little bit better at that, especially within football. I think it's getting there at certain levels, but I definitely think that we're needing to start kind of looking a little bit more into that. Now, supplements you mentioned, they're a hot topic. They can be a hot topic with regards to, are they clean? That's so obviously any supplement that an athlete puts in their body, they are accountable for. So if it contains something that is not approved by the World Anti-Doping Agency, you could get in a bit of trouble. But are they worth considering in injury situations, or should athletes focus more on food first?
I think food first is always the sort of first port of call. Yeah, let's see if we can get the diet right. And like I said earlier, if you can work with a nutritionist who has got software and you can keep a food diary, and you can check these things and say, okay, where are the gaps? That's the way I would work with most athletes. Say, let's do it. You can use a Fitness Pal or chronometer and do it yourself and see where there might be gaps. But if you work with a nutritionist, they can advise you on that and then see where the gaps is, maybe adjust the diet first port of call, and then say, okay, we're eating the right amount of calories, we're getting the protein right. Maybe there is some areas. Vitamin D is almost a no-brainer for me. We're in a northern latitude, winter months. It's not going to do any harm taking a vitamin D supplement, as long as, like you say, you're buying it from reputable source. I always use the Informed Sport suppliers, so they'll be batch tested, they're clean, and then whether it's a vitamin D supplement or a multivitamin, you just tick in those boxes. But after having looked at the sort of totality of the diet first.
Yeah, it brings home to me how complex nutrition actually is. And also, we have to balance that up with, I don't want players getting obsessed with it either.
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
and Ilona Maher, the rugby player, has done some great things surrounding nutrition. She said, if I want to have that burger, I'm having that burger. And I love that level of freedom. If you want to have something, have it, you know.
Yeah.
But I've also been in scenarios where maybe some old school attitudes towards food. Like, for example, and I had this conversation with Amy Ellen O'Keefe, who, of course, has her own business with regards to nutrition and works with England Red Roses, where you might have people that are influencing the players. So it might be parents, it might be coaches, are they have some beliefs. You shouldn't be eating that unhealthy pudding, right? But actually, if you're carb loading and before you have a game, actually for calories, have the pudding.
Exactly.
And for me, I always remember one nutritionist saying to me, it's really important that parents and coaches recognize that what comes out their mouth with regards to food, and especially what's on an athlete's plate, can have quite significant ramifications. And yeah, it's a very complex area, and I would really like to see a lot more support, because actually, just not even from a sport perspective, from a health perspective.
And I think what was interesting about the case studies as part of my studies is that the three players, two were quite young, just starting their careers, and the parents, the mothers came along to the sessions. And I think that was quite an important part
Yeah.
of the success of it, because it was somebody else who understood what they were trying to do. So when they were saying, oh, I need to buy this supplement, or I need to have some protein powders in for days where I don't feel hungry, but also the cooking skills, eating the right foods. It was an education for them that was in the support roles, which doesn't always happen, does it? You talk
No.
to the players and the messages are not getting through to the people that are supplying the food or buying the food or cooking the food.
And again, this comes back down to behavior change,
Mm.
because you can educate you can give them a list of things that you go to the shops and you buy that, right? But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, from a behavior change perspective, if a child or a younger player is needing to eat in a certain way, but the rest of the family is eating in a different way, there's an implementation barrier. So getting buy-in from almost the entire family, just from a health perspective, maybe isn't a bad shout. But yeah, I appreciate it's a really complex topic. I'm going to come back to you with regards to if there's somebody at the moment who's thinking, do you know what, my kid's injured, I need to put a little bit of extra protein in. You've obviously spoke about protein sources. Carbohydrate though, what would they need to go and buy? What would be the things that you would be advising?
The classic ones are pasta, rice, grains. Again, you've got to think about maybe some people's guts are not necessarily tolerant to it, but they will be the classic ones. But fruit and veg, just fruits, veg, going back to that eat guide, that is 50-60% carbohydrate, and it isn't we're not going to talk about ultra processed food today, because again,
Not today.
but there are healthy carbohydrates. There are foods you want your players to be eating. But like you said, at the end of the day, a piece of cake on a day when you're playing football and you're going out there for 90 minutes, or you're going to train for 2 hours, you're going to use those calories. You're going to use that carbohydrate. So it's not the end of the world to have those things in the diet. You don't want them as the core part of your diet, but strategically using those to help you on days when you need more energy is fine. But yeah, always looking back at the sort of healthy sources are the ones. So having fruit and veg, having fruit juices, using sports drinks on top of water, because sports drinks, one thing about sports drinks is that they tend to have the right balance of sugars, carbohydrate, and they'll have other things in there. They'll have electrolytes that will help as well. So then again, not a bad thing to have on training days, on match days. The quick, easy wins really, as far as carbohydrate.
They are, and I have to say, I do love a Haribo at halftime. That's usually just for the physio, not for the players. Like the Haribo's open at halftime. I'm suffering with stress. Phil, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you back on. I don't think this will be your last appearance on this podcast, because I think we've got a few things
But
that
not,
we'd like to say. If you are injured at the moment, please remember that cutting your calories is not something that we probably would advise. Look at your protein intake. Obviously, if you're getting gastrointestinal issues, please go and speak to somebody about these things. Do consider performance nutrition support if you are working with a club in any capacity. Always follow the evidence, and we will see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Women's Football Hub. The information within this podcast is for informational purposes only. No material on this podcast is intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please contact your doctor or another healthcare professional if you have any questions about anything raised in this podcast.